All right, welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is Pesticide Hazards and First Aid. And this is a pretty comprehensive chapter. There was a lot of information in it regarding things to do, how to prevent these things, what to do in case of emergencies. And so get ready. There's about 40-ish slides. And let's dive in. Okay, introduction. So pesticides are designed to be toxic to living organisms, which is why great care must be taken when using them. Pesticides vary greatly in how toxic they are to humans. The levels of toxicity vary greatly from species to species. Certain pesticides are designed to control animals, plants, etc. Insects and rodents and humans have similar nervous systems. So if something can affect an insect or a rodent and their nervous system, that's what it's designed to do. It can affect humans just the same. There can be short and long-term effects. And we also want to know signal words because they will also tell us how toxic a product actually is to humans. All right, so toxicity, exposure, and hazard. Toxicity is the ability of a pesticide to cause short or long-term injury. Basically, in a nutshell, it's the capacity to cause illness or injury. Exposure is when pesticides get on or in the body. And how does it do that? Through the skin, through breathing, through your mouth, through your eyes. That's how it's going to enter the body. High likelihood of exposure happens when we are mixing, loading pesticides, contaminated equipment, when we're out there doing spray applications, doing dusting applications, or cleaning up equipment. Basically, a hazard is toxicity multiplied by the exposure. So we can reduce our risk by choosing least toxic products or reducing our exposure. Like water-soluble bags, where it's easier to just throw a bag into a tank and let it dissolve. It's a lot easier to handle that and less risky than handling a liquid concentrate. Lock and load devices. I personally, in some of the forestry stuff that I do, we use a device that has herbicides that are contained in like a 22 shell, and we inject it into the trunk, and they're a lot less hazard to us as applicators compared to a cut stump treatment. The greatest hazard to an applicator is when he's mixing or loading, because that's when you're generally handling the concentrate product and you're the closest to it. Okay, so mixing and loading is the highest risk to the applicator, and that's because you're handling products in their concentrate form. You need to understand the pesticide that you are using. You need to understand how to handle it in the safest manner possible. And how do you understand the products? You read the label. The label will tell you how to handle the product. You as a pesticide applicator, you have a legal and moral obligation to protect yourself, other people, wildlife, pets that may be near the treated area or enter the treated area after your application takes place. And you have to have good safety procedures. You got to follow all the directions of the label. You need to have your PPE, and you need to know the required entry interval. So let's talk about the potential harmful effects of pesticides. Local effects occur to the area of contact, like skin, eyes, your respiratory system, and they have contact symptoms. So the skin could be irritated, could have burns, blisters, various things to the eyes. Breathing, you might have trouble breathing. Systemic effects occur once a substance is absorbed and distributed throughout the body. And systemic effects can be acute or they can become chronic. It all depends on the amount of exposure and what the pesticide is designed to do. Potential harmful effects of pesticides. Some examples of local effects. Skin, you have skin irritation. You could have itchy, redness, rashes, blisters, burns, discoloration, a tingling sensation. You could have dermatitis. Local effects on the eyes. You could have swelling, stinging, burning, eye irritation or injury. Sometimes the injury is irreversible. The nose, mouth, and throat. You could have swelling, stinging, burning. You could have permanent damage. Those are some of the examples of local effects. Some examples of systemic effects. Cholinesterase inhibition or neuropathies, which means nerve damage, impairment of blood clotting, some cancers. You could have reproductive issues. You could have an impaired metabolism. You could have a more hormonal changes or effects, and you could also have damage to organs. Okay, so what's the EPA's role in this? The EPA considers local and systemic effects when registering chemicals. And that's how they base their restrictions, how they apply the methods of use, the timing, the rates, what PPE and what REIs are needed for products. Allergic effects. Sometimes you can have a reaction to certain substances or formulations, and it can look, you can have blisters, hives, dermatitis. You could have more serious reactions like asthma and shock, which is life-threatening. And there's no way to predict the allergic effects until it happens. So you need to be aware. Whenever you're going to use a new product, you should be ultra conscious of your body. So common ways of exposure. We're going to start with the skin, otherwise known as dermal exposure. Not wearing gloves or PPE is the number one way that you're going to have exposure to pesticides. Not washing hands after using pesticides or applying them or mixing them. Not washing your hands before going to the bathroom. Splashing or spills getting on your skin. Spray or dust getting on your skin. Applying in windy weather, which you shouldn't be doing, but in case you do, you have a high potential of drift, and that can get on your skin. Or overhead applications. You spray over your head, and then the droplets drift back down onto you. Touching treated plants, soil, or livestock after they've been treated. As far as common ways of exposure on the eyes, you can rub your eyes with contaminated hands or gloves. You can get splashes into the eyes. Dry formulations without eye protection, so you're not wearing your goggles or your safety glasses. Could be windy weather, blows it on you. Or ways of oral exposure is not washing your hands prior to eating, drinking, chewing, smoking, and splashes into your mouth. And inhalation exposure can occur with poorly ventilated areas, mainly dusts, powders. You could have a poorly fitted respirator, or you could be exposed to spray drift. So let's talk about dermal exposure a little bit more. The main route of pesticide entry into the body is through dermal exposure. And some studies show up to 97% of exposure is during spray applications. Another way to get dermal exposure is through residues on treated surfaces. The effects can depend on the chemical properties, the area of contact, the rate of absorption into the body, and the body's ability to detoxify. Pesticide formulations vary in how well they can penetrate skin. So water-soluble liquids, wettable powders, dusts, granules have a hard time. Oil-based liquids, emulsifiable concentrates, are readily absorbed into the skin. And then right now on this slide that I'm at, I actually put a picture up of what is in the National Core Manual. It's figure 5.1. And it's an example of the percentage of absorption on the body. And this is something that you should definitely take a look at. The reason why they say always wash before going to the bathroom or eating is because of absorption. The genital area is 100% absorption. So if something touches there, it's getting absorbed. And generally, the highest areas of absorption are the warmest and the most humid. And so the absorption rate depends on where it is in the body. Softer areas, moist areas tend to absorb easier than drier, tougher areas. The longer a pesticide remains in contact with the skin, the more pesticide will be absorbed. High dermal exposure levels, making overhead applications, windy applications, using blowers or misters. So mosquito guys out there, if you're using a blower or mister, you're at a high exposure risk. Contaminated hands or gloves, transferring pesticides to other body parts. And then as a reminder, always wash your hands after a pesticide activity. Eye or ocular exposure. Eye tissues are extremely absorbent. Blood vessels are very close to the surface, which means pesticides can enter the blood very quickly. Absorption through the eyes can be particularly hazardous with certain products. If they're corrosive or if their label says may cause severe eye damage, yeah, they're going to affect your eyes. Eyes are sensitive to many pesticides. They can absorb large amounts of pesticides. Some products can even cause severe damage or blindness. And you can also get exposed through splashes, spills, dust, mists, broken equipment, say a hose breaks or something, and then rubbing of the eyes. Inhalation exposure. You want to protect your lungs when you're mixing and loading and applying pesticides, especially in confined areas. If inhaled, some pesticides can cause damage to nose, throat, and lung tissue. Once inhaled, pesticides enter the blood very rapidly, and it can cause aspiration, which is the suction of petroleum solvents or other substances into the lungs while vomiting, which can cause very severe damage. Okay, so oral exposure. Let's dive into this a little bit more. It can occur when mixing, loading, cleaning equipment. Never use your mouth to siphon a line. It can happen when you're eating and drinking or smoking. You should wash your hands prior to any of these activities. Improper storage, which you think improper storage, oral exposure, how does that work? Well, what if you stored a pesticide in a pop bottle and you thought, hey, that's just pop, it looks the same, and then you drink it? So improper storage can happen. Unlabeled bottles are improperly stored. Rodent baits. Children are the most common victims of oral exposure, which makes sense. They find a bait, they eat it, they lick it, they do something. Mark all pesticide measuring devices and containers. The reason for that is you don't want to use a measuring device that you use to measure pesticides to measure out ingredients for your next cake, And then you never want to store pesticides in food or beverage containers because, again, you could mistake it. Product toxicity and health concerns. Toxicity has been evaluated with subjecting animals, mice, rats, rabbits, dogs, and how they get subjected to that is through various dosages. So they might do a small dose, see what happens, and up the dose until they find that they're killing, the test animals. Products can have acute toxicity, which is short-term, or chronic toxicity, which is long-term. When pesticides are evaluated, they're evaluated on the immediate effects, not necessarily the long-term effects. Even subtle changes such as weight loss could be an indication of an underlying issue with a pesticide. So let's talk about acute toxicity. Acute toxicity is a measurement of harm caused by a one-time exposure event, either through systemic or contact exposure. Acute effects usually occur within 24 hours of exposure. Acute systemic toxicity measures illness or death, resulting from a critical body function changing. Comparison of acute toxicity is measured with LD50, and what LD50 stands for is lethal dose 50%. This is the dose that's required to kill 50% of the test subjects. That's LD50. It's generally recorded in milligrams of toxicant, of product, of pesticide, of active ingredient per kilogram of body weight. And it's through oral exposure or dermal. So you'll see an oral LD50 or dermal because those routes of exposure are different, right? If you're drinking a pesticide versus it being absorbed through your skin, more than likely one, it's going to take more to kill you or 50% of the test population if it's absorbed through the skin than if you drink it. There's also the LC50, which is the lethal concentration to kill 50%. Concentration of a chemical in the air or water required to kill 50% of test subjects. It's measured in parts per million or milligrams per liter. Common measurement of lethal effects of aquatic organisms, right? So if you look at an SDS sheet, you'll see if it's toxic to aquatic life or not. You'll see the LC50 rate. And this is all good stuff to check anyways. Go read some SDS sheets and some product labels and see what you find. LC50 are the most applicable to human health for concentration of chemicals in the air. So if you're applying fumigants or doing some massive sprays, things like that, that's what that's the one you're going to want to focus on. Okay, so the LD50 and the LC50 values are useful to compare products. Sometimes different formulations are less toxic, so you want to look at the SDS of various products to determine the LD50 and the LC50, and that can help you, right? The lower the LD50 value, the less it takes to kill 50% of subjects. So it's kind of counterintuitive, right? You would think a lower number, oh, it's less toxic. No, in this case, a lower LD50 value means it takes less product to kill you. A higher LD50 value means it takes more product to kill you. Okay, so keep that in mind. But there are limitations to the LD50 and the LC50. They only measure one effect, and that is death. It does not translate directly to humans because test animals are different. And measurement of a single exposure is how they're measured versus multiple exposures, which us in the industry, we have multiple exposures generally. All right. And then on this slide, it's highly recommend you look at the notes or you actually watch this presentation. But I also put a picture up. It's table 5.1 out of the core manual. These are signal words, and it kind of has a demonstration of why they have those signal words, as well as the LD50 or LC50. So yeah, you might want to take a look at that. It just explains the difference between danger, poison, danger, warning, caution, and caution or no signal word. And that all depends on what they affect, how they're toxic, how many milligrams per kilogram makes them toxic, things like that. So yeah, I would highly encourage you to read that. Signal words are a globally harmonized system. It's an international system for classifying, labeling, and hazard communication. It ensures consistency across the world. There's 4 distinct signal words: danger, poison, danger, warning, and caution. All right, so let's talk about danger, poison. It's highly toxic. It's a hazard class 1. The acute oral LD50 from trace amounts is from trace amounts up to 50 milligrams per kilogram. It has red letters and skull and crossbones. The LD50 is based on any route of exposure. Let's talk about the danger signal word, which if you're not watching this, if you're just listening to this, there's a picture of Clorox bleach and it has danger on it. Some hazard class 1 pesticides contain this signal word due to the potential of acute contact injury, permanent eye damage, skin or lung damage. Contact effects are more dangerous than acute systemic LD50. You want to consult the label and precautionary statements to understand the reason for the signal word and consult the SDS of the pesticide. So if I'm not mistaken, a pesticide that I use pretty frequently is called Garlon 3A. And I'm pretty sure it has a danger signal word. It has that because it's corrosive and can cause eye damage. But if I was to look at the LD50, it's like 4,000 milligrams per kilogram. It's a lot. And so that would actually put it more in the warning or caution side of things, I believe. So you really want to know why it has that. You want to consult the SDS. You want to look at the label and see. The warning signal word is considered moderately toxic. It's a hazard class 2. If the concern is due to systemic toxicity, acute oral LD50 will range from 50 to 500 milligrams per kilogram, which means 1 to 2 teaspoons of this product could be fatal to a 150-pound person. It could also be a concern through injury to skin, eyes, or respiratory tract. Warning signal word does not indicate if the concern is contact, systemic, or both. And you should always consult the label and the precautionary statements. The caution signal word. So caution means that it's slightly toxic. It's a hazard class 3 pesticide or chemical. It may be acute systemic or contact toxicity. If systemic, the LD50 range is 500 to 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. Contact effects are usually irritation, of eye, skin, and respiratory tract. And as always, consult the label and precautionary statements. All right, now let's talk about chronic toxicity. So we talked about the acute, which is short, one exposure. Let's talk about chronic, which is long-term exposure. It's determined by subjecting and testing animals to long-term exposure of an active ingredient. Typically, animals undergo 2 years of exposure before they can see chronic effects. Possible chronic effects could be genetic changes, non-cancerous or cancerous tumors, reproductive effects, infertility, fetal toxicity, miscarriages, birth defects, blood disorders, nerve disorders, hormonal and endocrine mediated diseases. If a product can cause chronic effects, if a product causes chronic effects, the manufacturer is required to include chronic toxicity warning statements on the label. It would also be listed on the SDS. There's no measurement equivalent for chronic toxicity. There's nothing like the LD50 or the LC50. So it's just what they've observed over testing over time. Delayed effects. So delayed effects are illness or injuries that do not appear immediately, which means within a 24-hour period. Generally, delayed weeks, months, years after exposure of a pesticide, could be days. It depends on the pesticide and the route of exposure. Delayed effects can be listed under precautionary statements and how to avoid exposures leading to them. It can be caused by acute exposure, which would be one-time exposure, or chronic exposure. Factors affecting response. So humans, like all other organisms, have a built-in mechanisms to reduce risks of toxic substances, even pesticides. The liver is the primary organ to alter toxic substances into less toxic or non-toxic forms. And then also kidneys. Kidneys filter water, soluble pesticides. Non-water soluble pesticides that cannot be filtered or stored are stored in fatty deposits throughout the body, also in breast milk. Most pesticides are eliminated relatively quickly from the body, generally hours to days, and we pee them out. It comes out in our urine. Some pesticides cause DNA mutations. Some are harmless, but some are pretty serious. Human bodies regularly produce enzymes that combat pesticides and other substances. Frequent exposure can overwhelm the body's capacity to eliminate or break down pesticides. So you want to keep your exposure as low as possible. Keeping the exposure as low as possible will reduce the likelihood of your body becoming overwhelmed. Symptom recognition. So symptoms can correlate with certain groups of pesticides. Insecticides can affect your skin, nose, and respiratory system. Fungicides are irritants to eyes and mucous membranes. Rodenticides, it can affect the blood's ability to clot. You can have bloody noses, bloody gums. Organophosphates and carbamate are cholinesterase inhibitors. Since systemic symptoms that can lead to respiratory failure and death. And synthetic pyrethroids, they can cause nausea, dizziness, weakness, nervousness, eye and skin irritation. So we're going to talk about a really big one. It's called a cholinesterase inhibitor. Cholinesterase is an enzyme necessary for proper nerve impulse transmissions and nerve function. If the enzyme is reduced below critical levels, nerve impulses can no longer be controlled. This can be a major issue. It can cause your heart to fail. It could cause breathing to fail. This is a serious thing. Small repeated doses over days or weeks reduces cholinesterase levels, and that can trigger mild, moderate, or severe symptoms. It's not always obvious if it is acute or delayed. So basically, let's go back one. Organophosphates and carbamates are going to be the ones that can cause this. And those are generally not used as often in today's world of pesticide applicators, but they still can be. And so we want to be aware of this stuff because it's serious. Cholinesterase monitoring. Every person has a baseline of cholinesterase. Each person's baseline is different. You want to establish a baseline prior to the use of organophosphates or carbamate insecticides. You want to always conduct the baseline in the off season or at least 30 days since the last use. If you are showing symptoms, contact your doctor or medical professional. So now we're going to get into the first aid of pesticide poisoning and what should we do? The first thing that we want to do is seek medical attention immediately if you or coworkers experience unexplained or unusual symptoms that occur within 24 hours of pesticide exposure. Do not wait until somebody is seriously ill. Take the pesticide label with you for the hospital and the physician. Initial effort to assist the victim. So say you show up and you see somebody's having some issues. You want to make sure that the person is breathing and that they're no longer exposed. Prior to going to them, you want to make sure that you yourself are protected. And then if they're not breathing, you want to administer CPR. And you only administer CPR if they're not vomiting and not breathing. So the label is the primary source of information. Beyond that, you would call the Association for Poison Control Centers, the AAPCC. Their phone number is 800-222-1222. First aid is first response. After the first aid is administered, you want to call 911 and get the victim to the hospital. You can also call the National Pesticide Information Center, otherwise known as NPIC. Their phone number is 800-858-7378. For pets, horses, livestock, you would call Animal Poison Control Center. Their phone number is 888-426-4435. So pesticide exposure to the skin, remove contaminated clothing, wash affected area with soap and water, avoid harsh scrubbing because the scrubbing can cause damage, which allows the pesticide to absorb, and dry the area. If chemical burns are present, you want to cover the area loosely with a clean, soft cloth. You do not want to use burn ointments, powders, or medications. And you want to wash and store contaminated clothing separately from family laundry. Okay, so pesticide in the eyes. What's the first aid for that? The eyes absorb material readily and quick. Quick action is required. You want to hold the eyelid open and immediately begin to gently wash the eye with clean water. Drip water across the eye, not directly into it. Use an eye wash dispenser if you have them. I have eye wash dispensers in my trucks, and in case anything happens, we have that. So I would encourage you to get one on your truck as well. Continuously rinse for 15 minutes or whatever the label recommends. Generally, from what I've seen, it's about 15 minutes. Be careful not to contaminate the other eye if only one eye was infected. So you'd want to cover that eye and make sure that none of this contaminated water gets into it. You want to cover the eye and clean with a clean cloth and seek medical attention immediately. All right, what if you have an inhalation exposure? What's the first aid for that? You want to move the victim into fresh air immediately. Carry them. You don't want them to have to overexert themselves. Do not attempt to rescue anyone in an enclosed, contaminated area unless you are wearing all of the necessary PPE. Warn others of the danger. Have the victim lie down. Loosen their clothing. Keep them warm and quiet. If they're convulsing, protect their head. Turn their head to the side and monitor breathing. At no point ever should you insert an object into a person's mouth if they are seizing. Keep their chin up, when that'll ensure that air passages are open. If breathing stops, administer CPR. Okay, what do we do if we get pesticide in our mouth or if we swallow it? We want to rinse our mouth with plenty of water. We want to drink a quart of milk or water and induce vomiting only if the label instructs you to do so. Never induce vomiting if the victim is unconscious or convulsing, swallowed corrosive poison, or swallowed an emulsified concentrate or oil solution. How do we induce vomiting? First of all, it's only a first aid measure until you get them to the hospital. Just know that. But you want to make sure that the victim is kneeling or lying on their side. You You want to have the victim drink at least 2 glasses of water to dilute the product. No carbonated drinks. You want to use your finger or a blunt object that's not sharp or pointed, and you basically stick it in the back of your throat to induce it. You want to collect the vomit for medical analysis. And additionally, you could also use activated charcoal, and they do make pharmaceutical grade activated charcoal, and it acts as a magnet to absorb chemicals. So something else that we're exposed to out there in the field a lot is heat stress. And heat stress can very closely look like a pesticide poisoning. PPE can increase the risk of heat stress. If you're wearing a respirator or coveralls, you're having to wear long sleeves and pants and boots, and it's 90, 100 degrees out, you're at a higher risk of heat stress. You want to recognize the symptoms: feeling ill, impairment, weak, tired, less alert, dizziness, clammy, hot, slurred speech, headache, severe thirst, dry mouth, heavy sweating, and then that can turn into a lack of sweating. And then you also want to be able to recognize heat stroke, which could be possibly life-threatening.